Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin. We have Jonathan over here.
Hello.
And this week, we're going to do something a little different. We're not going to cover every single thing that has happened this week to any degree of depth. Instead, we want to talk sort of thematically what's happening. Before we do, though, I just want to mention a couple things as it relates to the show. I've always laughed at people who watch MSNBC incessantly and, freak out over everything. And I don't want that to happen to this podcast, right? I don't want us to be the new Rachel Maddow. On the other hand, though, we can't normalize the things that are happening. We've made the promise that we're going to call out bullshit when we see it. And there are multiple things that this administration has done that is either just outrageous, unlawful, illegal, and frankly impeachable. And we're going to continue to be fair by calling out bullshit. And if one side is engaging in bullshit more than the other, you know what? It might seem partisan, but that's just the way the ball bounces.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to note. And from our own political perspectives, we are not far left. Neither one of us far left Democrats, right? But what we are is critical, right? I just professionally, that's my job, right? As a professor, I'm trained to be critical, and I am critical with things students say, with things we read, with stuff we see in life. And as an engineer, you tackle stuff from sort of the nuts and bolts approach. Hopefully, that's going to come through in the way we do criticize. And if it's heavy on the Republican criticism right now, well, they have the levers of power. They're doing the ridiculous things, and they are supporting the ridiculous things as well. So it seems like we don't really have much choice but to say, you know what, something's up here.
All right. So having said all that, let's talk about happier things. I hear you have a really good beer that's up my alley.
I think you would like this one. This is a coffee porter from Westbound and Down. I had something from them not too long ago. It's a local brewery. They're in Lafayette, as well as a town up in the mountains called Idaho Springs, where they started. But they've won a number of medals at beer festivals, I think at the Great American Beer Festival too. This beer in particular, I'm not a huge coffee fan, but this one works for me, right? Porters, if you're wondering what's the difference between a porter and a stout, stouts usually have a little bit more coffee flavor, a little bit more roasted flavor, whereas porters usually a little bit more malty, kind of more slightly sweet, but more balanced than a stout. Tends to have lower alcohol too. In this one, though, they've added coffee, and it kind of rounds out the flavor really nicely, right? It's not an in-your-face, tastes like dirt coffee, which is what bothers me, not being a coffee drinker. And it's just a very smooth, quality beer, great beer for winter. Unfortunately, the climate around here is kind of foiling me today as it's 65 degrees in Colorado, but still a good beer.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm all about bold flavors, sours, porters, stouts. So this is definitely up my alley. Okay, so for the theme of this week, we're just going to try and figure out what the heck is going on. There's been so many events in the news, and it's really difficult to really understand what's happening. I'm of the opinion that most of this is just theater, and Trump is testing the boundaries of executive authority, but he's really leveraging the media to project strength, right? If you listen to Ezra Klein or read his columns, he's basically saying that Trump is not acting like a president, leveraging legislative authority, working with members of Congress. He is trying to act like a king. So he's a strong king, but a weak president. And I still believe that we are a country of laws, and there has been enough pushback to Trump's actions so far where he's reined in stuff a little bit. And I know you disagree with me on that.
So my basic premise right now is that we just don't know, right? We could be in a position where it's all for show, and he's doing these things that he knows, and at the very least, his advisors know that courts are likely to overturn, and they think that'll be useful for them as a scapegoat. And so it's a good show for the base. It's exactly what you said, where he's pushing the boundaries, the courts will set some boundaries, and he'll behave kind of similarly to what he did last time. So he might be doing it all for show. He might be doing it as just to reinforce his base, or this might be the start of a constitutional crisis. We don't know yet, right? Because he's doing things that are blatantly illegal, and that he knows the court, or at least somebody there knows, that the court is going to overturn. And in a lot of ways, it looks like he's setting himself up to dare the courts to overturn these things. And whether or not he'll abide by that, continue to, or he won't, that's the question to me that's the most pressing and the most urgent to attend to.
Yeah, and for me, that is the red line. If they start disobeying court orders,
Oh, sure.
I think you go back to the original quote Muslim ban of Trump's presidency, and I think that's a very good indicator of how he wants to operate.
The difference that I see there, right, with the original Muslim ban, it was overturned, and they crafted another one. It was overturned. Eventually, they crafted one that fit the legal parameters that the court was laying out. Right, you saw them trying to work within the framework of the laws, trying to work with what the court was telling them, and trying to get them to sign off. This time, you don't see that attention to the legal aspects of these executive orders. And it's some interesting stuff we've linked in the show notes that goes into that in more detail. But basically, the things they're putting out, they know the court will almost 100% with certainty reject. Right? They're not trying to pass muster with the Supreme Court. They're doing stuff that they intend the court to overturn. Now, whether they're using it as a useful tool to say, haha, see, the swamp is against us, the court is part of that, just to keep the base ginned up, that's like the best case scenario, where they want to be overturned so they can pull back without having to pull back, to say, we want to pull back. The worst case scenario is that they say, you know what? Come enforce the law, right? And then we'll get into more of this later, but I think that's why we need to try to figure out a little bit more detail. What is going on? What is he up to? What is he trying to do?
Yeah, and I think the best example of Trump trying to navigate these waters is with the tariffs, right? I think most people on Wall Street, they figured that, the tariffs are just a bluff, it's bluster, right? They're prepared for them, of course, right? They always have to, their job is to model risk and what they think the markets are going to do, right? So they're prepared in some respects for massive tariffs, but they also don't think it's likely to happen. And so Trump this week, he said that he was going to have 25% tariffs on Mexico and 25% tariffs on Canada. He's really upset about the trade imbalances and fentanyl. Now, Mexico and Canada retaliated with tariffs of their own, right? And you sort of have to. If you believe that you're being bullied, just accepting the punches is likely to get you bullied some more, right?
Well, I think technically Mexico threatened to put in tariffs, and then it did, because they didn't get much further than that, whereas Canada was getting ready to do so. But yeah, I think a major point that I would pull from them, I know you're getting to, is that he pulled back, right? He came up with a deal. And I think the difference, though, there between that and the court stuff is that the courts didn't make him pull back, right? Nobody challenged him. He declared victory because he got some sort of concessions that he could pass off to people as, hey, I won, right? There was nothing in domestic politics, right? Whether it be the fellow Republicans, the Democratic opposition, the Congress, right, or the courts that reined him in at all on this, right? Everybody basically stood back and say, this is your arena, free reign, right? So I'm not sure, from my perspective, that the experience with tariffs is a helpful experience to understand how he's going to test the limits domestically.
So I think the pushback was the market itself, right? The market tanked.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anything that Trump is sensitive to, it's how well the stock market is doing. Mm-hmm. So he's sensitive to polling as well. And he's not going to win a trade war, right? Because there's going to be a rally around the flag effect for both Canada and Mexico. And you've seen this in Canada too. Canadians are pissed. At NBA games, they're booing the national anthem. You had multiple governors, I guess that's what you call them, like say in like Ontario, Nova Scotia, what have you. They're saying that they don't want to have American alcohol on the shelves, right? So
I believe the
even
governor of Ontario canceled his Starlink plan with Musk.
right. So I mean, like, we can all laugh at, how pathetic that resistance is. But I think what it shows is that, well, the people within those respective countries, they're ready for a fight. Whereas I think Americans, even though America would win a trade war if all things are equal, the American people don't want to have, they don't want this fight, right?
Well, I mean, I think beyond that, right? You talk about Trump being sensitive to that. He is sensitive to that in the point that he doesn't necessarily want to give his MAGA types a reason to challenge or question his philosophy, right, or his message, his approach. So if he can, and if you'll note, when he's calling for tariffs and declaring what we need to get, he's exceptionally vague on the goals, right? We
Right.
need to cut down illegal immigration and cut down fentanyl. Well, the Canadians have about this much illegal immigration coming in and probably less fentanyl, right?
Right.
So any win he gets, see, I won. He left it open so he could declare victory
Right.
about anything. And he is the deal guy, right?
Right.
So the tariff experience, what ended up happening, didn't surprise me, and it won't surprise me if that's the way he's approaching tariffs all along, right? He's the guy with the tariff hammer, so everything looks like a tariff nail. But he thinks, if I've got the tariff hammer and there's the tariff nail, we can have some sort of deal where I can come out looking great, right? And we'll get some little concession that I can pass off as I'm fighting for the little guy.
Right. And the concession by the Canadians was basically nothing, right? They had already agreed with the Biden administration to do X, Y, and Z. And I think the only thing that changed was there was going to be some sort of fentanyl czar on the Canadian side. That's basically it, right?
It was, I mean, I like to cite one of my favorite plays, the Pirandello play, 6 Characters in Search of an Actor, right? This is basically some solutions in search of a problem. Right. There's no immigration crisis to speak of or fentanyl crisis to speak of coming from Canada. Most of that comes from Mexico, right? And a lot of it comes through legal ports of entry.
Right.
So
most of it, I think.
At least a large part of it, right? And so to think that there was going to be a meaningful solution that was going to meaningfully affect citizens of the United States is just silly. It was this thing. I think the tariffs with Canada, especially, were complete theater for the base. Right? This is an example of something that he's trying to make himself look like the tough guy who's fighting for them, and he got the Canadians to give, and he got a deal.
Yeah, and on the other side with Mexico, I read that they're adding 10,000 troops. My understanding is that they had 15,000 troops from the first attempt at a trade war during the first Trump administration. And then throughout the Biden administration, you've had ups and downs with troop levels. So I don't know if there's any meaningful change there, right?
Again, the border is, relatively speaking, fairly quiet right now. Right? When we shut down access and shut down asylum things and basically once Biden decided to put a stop to things, the border has been very calm, and it's even more calm now. Mexicans throwing in 10,000 troops, probably helpful still, probably not going to make that much of a difference.
Right. But the important thing is he could sell it.
Yeah, and if you really wanted to do something, he'd ask Panama to put 10,000 troops in the Darien Gap, and then we'll stop bothering them about the canal. That would stop a lot of the illegal immigration.
Yeah. So I think, like, especially when it comes to foreign policy, Trump is trying to project toughness. Yes. And there was this incident with Colombia a week or two ago where I guess America, or rather we sent some Colombian illegal immigrants back there, but it was on a military plane instead of a charter plane. And there was some sort of confusion with the Colombian government, and it got sent back. And that pissed off Trump. He threatened 25% tariffs and then 50% tariffs the next week. But from what I've read, I'm not in diplomacy, so, take this with a grain of salt. From what I've read, this is pretty standard where, there are miscommunications between countries, and
well, I think it was a little beyond that. I read some stuff where the people in Colombia were genuinely pissed and saying you need to treat our citizens like human beings rather
Okay.
than cattle or whatever. So there was some genuine disagreement. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. But again, we have tariff hammer guy with
Right.
tariff nail problem, and this was probably the worst thing that could have happened to for the world, the United States and the rest of the world, for his first foray into getting concessions with the tariff to work, right?
Right.
And he's like, hey, this works. So Canada, Mexico, you're next. China, we're after you next. Japan. He was talking about Japan today, making threats about, yeah, we're gonna end the trade imbalance with Japan right away, right? And he's threatened Europe. So he's got his hammer. There's lots of nails out there, but this is the kind of thing, right, where he does constrain himself because there are impacts on his political fortune, right? The courts and the American institutions that generally restrain a president don't do that. Nobody's telling him you can't do this because this is a ridiculous way to conduct diplomacy, right? Which it is, and it would be horrible for the economy, which it would be. They're just saying, yeah, go Trump. At least the people that matter to him. And so any restraint he's showing is restraint that he's creating on his own.
Yeah, and the administration is really leveraging media, right? I don't want to insult Colombia, but at the end of the day, it's not a major country, and for Trump to brag about this massive victory with such a small country, I think this is going into a strategy of I am projecting strength, right? And you will know about what I'm doing.
Sure.
Which is the exact opposite of the Biden administration, right? The Biden administration expected all of us to be informed by reading the New York Times about all the great things he did. And you know what? That's not the reality that we live in. And right. I will give Trump credit. He is taking every little thing that he's doing, and he's making sure that his people and the rest of the world know what he's doing.
Well, I mean, and this is we're going to have a serious debate on this coming up. But this is my point, right? Is that Trump controls the narrative. Right, he's in firm control of the narrative of the United States, and the Democrats basically don't have a valid response right now, right? And I think once we get into a little bit more about what he's up to and why he might be doing it, I think if we talk about this narrative, the discussion of the narrative, I think will be interesting, because I know like my thought is like if the Democrats really want to do something, they need to have some sort of grassroots resistance where people are angry about things. And you're not going to get that to happen unless you can grab their attention by having some sort of impact on the narrative. And you need to start doing that now, in my view, if you want to have any sort of chance at turning things around at the midterm election. You can't cede the field for Trump. You can't let him continue to control the narrative of, hey, I'm projecting strength. Hey, I'm battling the swamp. Hey, this is me fighting for you, and they're standing in the way. Right now, the Democrats are the standing in the way people to everybody that believes Trump's narrative. And they need to turn that around and make them be the people that are, hey, we're actually fighting for you. We're trying to protect you from the ridiculous things that he's doing.
Yeah, let's use an example here. So I think the thing that made the most news, at least among the New York Times readers, was shutting down USAID. And so this is the executive agency that deals with the allocation of foreign aid throughout the world, right? And in terms of legality, it sure seems illegal to just fire everyone. But at the same time, USAID was set up via executive order. So legally speaking, I can't say that it's unlawful or anything like that. I could probably say that firing the employees, they have protections, right? But, saying that you want to transfer employees from USAID to the State Department, maybe. We'll let the courts deal with that, right?
Well, but that's not their plan, though.
No, of course not. No, they just want to kill foreign aid.
They want to get rid of all of them. They want to fire all but 200 of them, from my understanding. Something like, there's like 10,000 people that work there now?
Right. And I think this is where the Trump administration has a lot of power. And at the end of the day, their message is the deep state, so all these government employees, number one, they're against my agenda. Number two, they don't actually do anything. And then number three, foreign aid just isn't popular in America. The perception of foreign aid is that it's a waste from the point of view of a lot of people, right? We've looked at the polling, and I can't give you the exact numbers, but people in general think that 25% of the U.S. budget goes outside of America. Whereas the reality is that it's less than 1% of the budget.
Yep. Well, this is exactly a really good example. I'm glad you brought it up, of how the Republicans control the narrative.
Yeah.
Right? When you ask, and it's not that the USAID employees aren't doing anything. It's that they're actively working against the United States and against the citizens by sending money overseas. Right. That's how they become the scapegoat for Trump. Right. And it's they've convinced people, as you say, that we spend all this money on foreign aid and we don't get anything back, and they're taking advantage of it because the Democrats have no response to along the lines of, actually, foreign aid is really good for us. By distributing foreign aid, we help build markets that buy our goods. We help fight disease over there instead of bringing it over here. If, for example, right, we don't have Ebola in this country because we're giving money to the people overseas in Africa that are keeping Ebola contained when it breaks out, right? Do you want to have Ebola here? Probably not. COVID was bad enough. And it's, by and large, not anywhere near as fatal a disease as Ebola is, right? There's all kinds of things foreign aid does that are good for Americans. But as you say, it's not popular because, and this predates current Trump and current Democratic officials, the Democrats have never made a good case for it. They've never convinced people this helps make us prosperous, right? And so by extension, they can't answer that question at all. They don't really have, in my mind, right, a good narrative to combat the narrative Trump has created for himself.
Yeah, I mean, the Republican narrative used to be that this was a way to combat China, right? We know that China has made some inroads into South and Central America, Africa as well.
Mm-hmm. And earlier than that, it was a way to combat the Soviet Union too,
right?
It's always been a way to expand our soft power, make people like us want to be on our side, and now we just don't care, apparently.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's really dangerous, because it's difficult to sell that helping people over there and not here is a winning message, right? You can't. That is what you're up against, because that's what MAGA is arguing.
And I mean, there's a reason that Emerson's quote about charity begins at home has lasted so long, because it is important, right? But again, if you don't have a counter to this is 25% of the budget, that message is really going to be a problem. But if you come up with, hey, it's less than 1% of the budget, and these are all the benefits. I mean, if you really stress the Ebola message, that's going to strike home to people. Do you want this here? Because it will come here if we don't stop it there, right? Do you want to have more malaria in this country? If malaria is spreading, it's coming north because of of climate change. Florida and Texas and states in the South can be prime grounds for malaria. We're learning how to fight malaria better over there so we can protect ourselves here. There's you want to work in a manufacturing job that makes a lot of money. Well, if we build these countries up a little bit, they'll buy our goods, right? There are messages out there, and it's not going to be okay, foreign aid, right? It's not going to be an easy sell,
right?
But there's a better approach than what the Democrats do right now, which is not really much at all.
Yeah, they really do take it for granted, right? A lot of these institutions, they want them to hide in the dark because, one, it is difficult to message, but two, they by and large work. Mm-hmm. They can always be reformed. I don't think anyone's going to argue that these institutions are perfect, but it's better to have them than to not have them, as far as I'm concerned. So I have a list of some of the canceled contracts out of USAID, and some of these are clinical studies that were just stopped because they ran out of funding. So we have malaria treatment for children under 5 in Mozambique, treatment for cholera in Bangladesh, cervical cancer screenings in Malawi, and HIV vaccine studies in South Africa. So again, I do think it's difficult to say, hey, well, why do we need to worry about people in Bangladesh, right? And I think what you can do is you have to use visual aids. You need to show what it looks like to actually die from cholera. One of the most effective protests I've seen is called the Capitol Crawl. And basically this was legislation this was a protest to get legislation for disabled people. So they had a bunch of disabled people get out of their wheelchairs and struggle up the Capitol steps. And you see these like children, some without limbs, just crawling on their bellies up the stairs. And lo and behold, Congress acted.
So I'm not convinced that it has to be like all visual like that, but it has to be visceral in one way or another.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways you can reach people, right? And the Democrats need to try to use those more. They need to try to hit all the opportunities. Visual stuff is great. Personal accounts are great. Hearing from people that go through this experience, right? Talking to, and if you want to talk about miserable ways to die, Ebola, from what I've read, is as miserable as it gets, right? And it's got to be more though than just scaring people. It's got to be showing them, hey, and you'd like to hope, at least a little bit, that we're a little bit better than we only are going to help you if we're worried that if we don't help you, it'll kill us. So hopefully, we can appeal to people's better angels a little bit. At the same time, show them, hey, this is good things that happen from aid. These are bad things that happen if we don't, right? But again, needs to be part of a larger story, right? And that larger story needs to figure out what Trump's up to and what can you do about it, right? Because as we just said, it could be that Trump's just doing everything as a show for the base. And he always does this. He's very good at it. So hopefully he's doing it again, right? He's doing these things. He expects them to be overturned. He's going to piss and moan about it. But there you go, right? It could be that he's just doing random crap has no real plan. That's entirely possible. He's famous for having a short attention span and famous for just listening to the last person he talks to. And kind of did a little bit of that last term. That's possible too, that there's no real malicious intent. But it doesn't necessarily seem that way, right? It could also be that he's making a concentrated effort to try to maximize his power. And it sounds, again, like we talked at the beginning of the top of the show here. That sounds a little bit like, oh my God, the sky is falling, right? And could he even come up with a plan? And I think the answer to that is, well, probably not. But he's now allied with the wackiest righties out there. And we've talked about Russell Vought. We talked about Miller and Patel. And all those people are right behind the idea that we need to have a maximalist president, and Trump needs to be able to be as Trump as he wants to be, do anything he wants to do, and people should not get in his way. And it's seeming, unfortunately, more and more likely. And I do think it's entirely possible that I'm wrong about this. I really hope I am. I hope I'm Chicken Little running around in the yard saying the sky is falling. But there's a lot of evidence that's just hard to ignore, right? You start with January 6th, right? The man has actually tried to have a coup. Beyond that, he's acting, as I said a couple times, blatantly illegally with his executive orders, right? He's putting out executive orders that he, or at least people around him, know aren't going to pass legal muster, and they don't seem to care. And they're doing this all over the place, from birthright citizenship to stuff about foreign aid to firing people. Everything under the sun, doesn't care, right? He seems to be teeing up a confrontation with the Supreme Court, right? If you are really trying to get these policies in, you'll do like what he did with the Muslim ban. You'll try to figure out what the court would want. You try to adjust to being rejected, but that doesn't seem what they're doing right now. And the GOP is already falling in line behind him. Tom Tillis from North Carolina has already said, yeah, some of these things are unconstitutional, but don't bellyache about that. It's kind of behind you, kind of like what presidents do, which is just not true, but it is very much like what Trump is doing. And J.D. Vance has come out and said, you know what, pull a Jackson and tell the court, go ahead to enforce. And again, we don't need to get into Vought. He's completely behind that as one of the architects of Project 2025. But even outside the GOP circles, right, big tech is lined up behind him, led by Elon Musk and his billions of dollars that he's happy to put into Trump's disposal. And the media is even falling in line, right? They're settling or trying to settle left and right. They seem to be scared of Trump in terms of what he can do to their business models. So either, right, it's a vast overreaction, or he's at least preparing to see where this can go.
Yeah, and I think this is where any sort of theater can become reality. If you don't put up any sort of resistance, then the perceived power becomes actual power, right? because
Yep.
power is meant to control. And so if you're not resisting, then you're being controlled.
Yep.
And I think this is where, corporate media is starting to get in trouble. If you're at CBS, right? Well, who's the parent company? It's Paramount. Well, Paramount has different interests than what CBS News has interest in, right?
They're interested in a proposed merger they have
Right.
going, and they think if they settle with Trump and give him millions of dollars, it'll grease the wheels.
Right. And ABC News is in the same boat with Disney.
Yep.
Now, I do think that more independent media, so even though New York Times is publicly traded, they don't really answer to anyone except the majority shareholders, right?
Yeah,
And, and,
that's their only product, more or
right.
less. Their product is maintaining credibility so people like you and I will continue to read it. If they lose that, they will lose everything they have, whereas Paramount and Disney have other interests. It does raise the question, right? So who's going to stop him? Right? There's no reasonable opportunity or possibility of the GOP acting like they did under Nixon, marching down to the White House and saying, "Hey, you've gone too far, you've got to go." That's just not going to happen. Right? Congress is not going to be able to stop him because the GOP don't care and they're in charge. Right now, it falls on the courts, and the courts have been stopping some of the things he's up to, but they have no real enforcement power. They're powerless without the norms of following the rule of law. They can't make Trump follow the rule of law. And his relationship with norms, kind of sketchy. So we're
Yep.
basically relying on him deciding that, you know what, this norm of following the courts needs to stand. I'm not completely sold that that will be the case. And if it's not, right, a politicized and purged military, which he's after, and a politicized and purged FBI, which he's after, they're not likely to stop him, right? What the time you have to, in my view, you need to stand up, like you're saying, before it gets that far. You need to resist and do something before we have this all-out constitutional crisis.
Yeah. And you know what? The grim reality is I'm not convinced that a constitutional crisis is going to wake up this country, right? We had this opportunity when we saw what happened with January 6th, and the country said, I can tolerate that as long as prices go down and the scolding from the Democrats goes down and I can live my life as I see fit, right? That's effectively why the Republicans won.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're right with that, right? And it raises the question of, well, why is Trump doing this, right? If he doesn't think that if people don't care one way or another, right? Of course he's going to do it, right? He thinks it's going to work. He thinks it's been effective in the past, and he's clearly attracted to power. But I think beyond that, if you got him to answer honestly, and I think he's told us this with his admiration of President Xi, he likes the idea potentially of president for life or third term. So while I don't think he's decided full 100% this is what he's going after, if that's a side effect, I don't think that's a problem for him, right? But will it work is another story. As you said, a lot of Americans came to terms with January 6th, right? If the economy stays fine and the average citizen doesn't notice any issues, are they going to care, right? Americans have had a great propensity for believing crap when there's no alternative narrative that's pressing on them. We had the Red Scare, which was before my time. I'm not that old, but there was a big child abuse scare in like the 70s and 80s, mostly in California, by the way. There's a Satanism scare. I remember playing Dungeons and Dragons in the early 80s, and parents were like, oh, this is going to lead to Satanism. There was even a TV movie about Dungeons and Dragons players becoming Satanists. Right? We had a big gay scare. We still do from time to time. And the Democrats don't have a competing narrative right now. There's no fighting the Depression. They're fighting World War II or the Cold War or the moonshot. There's no 9/11, right? The Democrats, to the average person, seem like they've been captured by progressives and the woke left. And they don't have a message that the average American could tell you what they're for, I don't think.
So I think that's a pretty good place to stop. It does sound like a lot of doom and gloom, and but there's no getting around that, right? The Trump administration is doing blatantly illegal things, and the courts have told them to stop, right? So And you know, they have stopped so far, but if you don't put up resistance, then that increases the likelihood of Trump actually ignoring court orders.
Yes, and I would much rather, in the situation we find ourselves in, see the Democrats prepare and be wrong than keep quiet and like, oh, look what he did, right? And I do think preparing can be a deterrent in itself, right? Kind of silly to talk about sort of the mutually assured destruction aspect of deterrence, but deterrence is letting people know there will be consequences if you take certain actions. So if the Democrats can prepare some sort of resistance a little better than they're doing now, I think they'll be better positioned to try to rein some stuff in. And I think you're right. I think it does kind of tee us up. We'll stop right here with the doom and gloom, and maybe next week, barring some complete catastrophe, get in more detail about what Democrats can do, right? How they can push levers of government, how they can try to maybe capture the narrative a little bit. I know we both want to discuss what's going to happen with the debt ceiling, how that can be a point of leverage, right? Something to do a little bit of pushback and get a little bit of attention from voters who they're going to need to come over to their side for the 2026 midterms.
Yeah, the leverage that the Democrats have definitely is going to be related to the budget, right?
Yep.
You know, I believe it's mid-March is when we run out of funding. So we have a debt ceiling issue, we have a budget issue. That's where you can actually flex your muscles there.
Let's hope.